In this episode today, I speak with Reverend Dr. Glenn Balfour all about women in leadership and especially the passage 1 Corinthians chapter 11. So we're going to do a deep dive on that passage today. Now, before we start the episode, if you are an AOG GB minister and you have not signed up for CPD, what are you doing? You need to sign up. It's a free platform. You can go and sign up today and you can log and track all of your professional, personal development activities, the books you've been reading, the courses that you've been on. You win points, prizes. It gives you a log of everything you're doing. And you can also do it in community with other ministers as well. So you can see what they're learning from as well. So sign up today, portal.aoggb.com, and you can get signed up on CPD. Right, on with the show.
That's CPD Show.
Welcome back to That CPD Show. I'm joined once again by Reverend Dr. Glenn Balfour. Glenn, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you back on.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Brilliant. Well, today we're kind of doing a kind of a second part on looking at women in leadership. Now, the first podcast I spoke with Dr. Lucy Pepiat and kind of had a look at the sort of the broader picture of women in leadership and how we think about that. And so I would really recommend that ministers, if you're watching this, listening to this, watch that first. It's a really great sort of primer episode. And now what we're going to do today is we're going to do a deep dive, and we're going to do a deep dive on 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 2 to 16. Obviously, we'll dive into that. But before we do that, it is a time-honored tradition that we talk about desserts. Now, fortunately, it is your second time on the podcast, Glenn. So we do not talk about desserts. We talk about main course. This is a new tradition set by Mark Button. And so that all second-time guests don't talk about their favorite dessert, they talk about their favorite main course. So, Glenn, I am really excited to find out, what is your favorite main course?
That is a great question. I am more of a savory person than I am a sweet person. So if ever I was going to have just two courses, I'd always have a starter and a main, not a main and a pudding. So this is more my go-to kind of thing. I like seafood. I love seafood. I've had lots of different types of seafood, he says. But one thing I've never had is lobster. I was just brought up on the wrong side of the tracks to ever have lobster. I would love to have lobster. That would be a nice meal to have. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. A really good, very good choice. And like you, I do love seafood. It's one of those things that at home, I'm never going to cook fish. My wife doesn't like fish, so it's just one of those things that's not likely to ever really happen. So when I go to a restaurant, I usually pick fish, and that's always a good thing to go for. And I have once had lobster, and if my memory serves me correct, it was on we were on a cruise with my parents. It was their 50th wedding anniversary. Took us on this lovely cruise, and I got to have lobster, and it was, as I hoped, absolutely delicious.
There you go.
So I can highly recommend. So if you like, if you like seafood, if you like crab, if you like things like that, it will just be excellent. So
I love seafood. The only seafood I had once that really I couldn't take was when I was out in Malaysia one time. They have sea cucumber.
ooh,
And, if you don't know something is a vegetable or an animal, that probably tells you that it might be dodgy to eat. And I have to say, I found that difficult to stomach, shall we say? But apart from that, I love all seafood, and so yeah, I will follow your recommendation and have lobster thermidor, I believe we call it. None of us
yes,
quite knows what thermidor means. It
no.
must be heated or hot or something like that. But yeah,
Yeah,
lobster is.
I always think of lobster thermidor as just sort of posh lobster. So I don't know. Who knows what it
Yeah,
means? I certainly
yeah.
don't. So brilliant. All right. Well, lobster, an excellent choice. Mark chose steak, and you've chosen lobster. So I think we've got two very strong main courses. We'll have to see who else is going to come on the podcast a second time to add to that main course catalogue that we've got. Okie dokie. We're gonna pivot very, very quickly. I can't pivot from seafood into 1 Corinthians chapter 11 at all. So I'm just going to just do a simple move, and we're going to talk about 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 2 to 16. We're going to do a real deep dive into that. So what I thought would be probably good to do is for everyone that is watching along, listening along, I'm going to just read the passage that we're going to talk about. And it just, I think, to be able to really dive into what we're talking about. And so I'm going to read it and then we'll get going. I am reading, for those who are very much interested I'm reading from the NIV. My dad calls it the nearly infallible version. I'm not saying that's correct, but discuss, as you'd say. I will read it then and we'll get going. So here it is. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well cut her hair off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her hair uncovered? With her head uncovered, I should say, with her head uncovered. Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. A classic passage, and I think most people will know that. Contentious passage, multiple views and things. So I think, Glenn, before we dive into actually, the actual passage itself, it'd be probably really good to look at some of the context around it. So talk to me about Corinth, because this is the letter to the Corinthians. So I think we've got to kind of situate ourselves in the world of the Corinthians before we can really dive into anything further. So talk to me about Corinth and the sort of the situation of the letter.
Sure. And this is the sort of stuff you could get by doing your own search on, Corinth in the Bible kind of thing. So I'm not going to come out with anything, left of scene, as it were, that, completely changes the way we read it. I would say that there are three things to be aware of about Corinth, maybe a few extras chucked in there. Number one, it was a city port. So just put those two things together in the ancient world. It's a city and a port. It's urban by ancient standards, over 100,000 population, which might not sound that big to us, but that made it one of the biggest cities in the ancient world that we're aware of, at least. Lots of economic inequality by our standards anyway, not by ancient standards. So you've got your citizens, who are the people who really are the top rung, as it were, and obviously poor on the odd occasion, for the sake of the gospel, taps into the benefits of being a Roman citizen. You've got your free men, which are kind of people who are not slaves, but they run a trade. So that could go from very poor working class to quite middle class, if you like. That could cover a broad band. And then the biggest group of people, they reckon that 3 in every 4 people were pretty much this in ancient cities, were your slaves. And your slaves were someone's property. And therefore slaves could be treated quite well, and they could be treated very barbarically. It really depended on the whim and the character of the master or the mistress. So that was kind of how it was socioeconomically. Right near places like Athens, and Athens was one of the 2 main seats of intelligentsia in the ancient Greco-Roman world. There was Athens in Greece, and there was Alexandria in Egypt, just up there on the coast. And Corinth is only about 50 miles west of Athens. It's also a port, so you've got lots of people, lots of sailors, lots of cargo, lots of commerce going through it, and so therefore it was known for what we would call its licentiousness. And in actual fact, it would seem that there was a term called to Corinthianize someone, and to Corinthianize someone was to take them into a life of immorality, if you like. So there was all of that going on. And it's interesting, of course, one of the questions that is asked and that Paul answers in the letter to the Corinthians is all about how should we behave in terms of our sexual ethics and our behavior, which would have been highly relevant. Few other things maybe to mention. It was a state of what were called mystery religions. There were lots of these going on at the time. And I guess the mystery religions were the kind of ecstatic personal encounters with your demon god or your spirit god kind of things. There were a lot of mystery religions going on. And again, that makes a lot of sense of the fact that Paul writes to the Corinthians, particularly about spiritual gifts. And when you read the first few verses of chapter 12, it's very clear that supernatural empowerment, shall we say, was something they were already familiar with from their in the Lord, in Christ days. So that's kind of how I'd summarize Corinth. It might be that there are some things that are directly relevant to this text and to this chapter. In actual fact, there is a notion that the prostitutes in the city would have had their hair short, probably for hygiene reasons in actual fact, but they'd have had their hair short. And is that being picked up by Paul in this chapter about that's not how we're going to dress kind of thing? Who knows? Who knows? But that's the kind of broad picture of Corinth.
And would there have been any link to some of the philosophical side of things like cynicism? So I know was it Diogenes? Was he Corinthian?
Yep.
So
yes. So Corinth is only 50 miles away from Athens, as I mentioned, and all of the founders of all of the ancient Greek philosophies, right from Plato, right from who obviously is the founder of Platonism, which is the kind of motherships of all things Greek philosophy. You've got Diogenes, you've got the Cynics, you've got Zeno, who founds the Stoics. All of these people come from Athens. So this kind of seat of Greek philosophical learning would have been 50 miles down the road, absolutely. And again, that's kind of picked up in Corinthians as well, in as much as if you were going to summarize all of the Greek philosophies, it would be spiritual is good, physical is not good or bad or irrelevant. So therefore, what's my response to the physical? Do I indulge it? Do I have total abstinence in all areas? And different Greek philosophies have different answers to that. But the fact that Paul has to speak about the relevance of our physical bodies to our faith is really important. So he wants to make a point. Do not join your body together with a prostitute, because your bodies are owned by the Lord. You are not your own. You were bought at a price. And that would have been quite relevant to a world that considered the body as this cage that one day would be freed from. So absolutely, there would have been connections with things philosophical as well in a place like Corinth. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And then that's the context of Corinth and all the kind of influences there. And then obviously we have the letter, and there's obviously, to get to chapter 11, we've got to go through 10 chapters first that gets us to that point. Talk to me about the letter and where we place chapter 11 within that context of Paul's thoughts and his the general flow of his letter up until that point, and maybe a little bit afterwards as well.
Yeah, great. So it's obviously made up of 16 chapters. So we'll leave chapter 16 out of it for these purposes, at least, because that's a chapter of final instructions and goodbyes, if you like. So we'll leave that chapter out of it. And the first 15 chapters really divide into two unequal halves, if you like. Both halves addressing issues that clearly have been raised by and are practical to the believers in Corinth. So it's a very hands-on, practical letter, almost the opposite in that respect to Paul's letter to the Romans. Romans is obviously the only letter that Paul writes to a group of people that he's never met before. And so that's what scholars call Paul's non-occasional letter. He doesn't know what the occasion is that he's writing into. So he gives the best version of himself, which is fairly rabbinic, as you might imagine. You do get that in all the other letters, but in 1 Corinthians, like all the others, they are written into live situations. And it's the live situation that dictates, as it were, or rather determines what Paul's going to say. This letter is the most specific in terms of speaking into situations. So the first 6 chapters look as if Paul is addressing 2 problems related specifically to Chloe's people, the church that meets in Chloe's house, which is quite an interesting sidebar for the conversation that we're having today, but we'll have that another time. What does it mean that it's the church that meets in Chloe's house? How much is she in a leadership role in the church? And we'll have another discussion about that some other time. But the 2 things that clearly are an issue that have been raised among Chloe's people is, number one, divisions. So Corinthians 1 to 4 is all about divisions, how they are a reality and how they shouldn't be a reality. Then chapters 5 and 6 go on to the matter of sexual behaviour, frankly, which again is, a topic that's fairly relevant to every generation in every context in the whole world, but needless to say has a particular relevance to the people in Corinth at this time. So that's the first 6 chapters, really dealing with those 2 matters that are highly relevant for, as it were, Chloe's people. Then from chapter 7 onwards, and this takes us right through to the end of chapter 15, chapter 7 onwards, Paul seems to be addressing specific matters that the church at Corinth itself has raised to Paul. And so chapter 7 starts with the words, "Now concerning the matters that you wrote to me about." And every so often he breaks in again, "Now concerning this, now concerning this." So we have kind of 3, 4, 5 different subjects that Paul speaks into. Chapter 7, he starts where he left off. He starts with the subject of sexual ethics and sexual behavior and marriage, and the right context for everything. So that's in chapter 7, which again is a fascinating podcast all on its own sometime, but that's for a different occasion. Chapters 8 and 9 then kind of sort of launch off this meat offered to idols. And it would have been meat as in flesh, meat offered to idols in the form of idolatry. And so Paul spends 2 chapters looking at that whole subject of idolatry and opens it up. And really, if I was going to summarize those 2 chapters, is that just because something is your right, and Paul's right is the earth belongs to the Lord and everything in it, so I'm going to eat everything with thanksgiving. That's his right. But just because it's your right, that doesn't make it right. What is right is what's of the greatest benefit to building people up in their faith, kind of thing. So that's really chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 10 is a bit more on idolatry and learning from history, learning from Israel's history in that sense. Again, we might not think that idolatry is relevant to our world, but when we realize that idolatry is worshipping anything in the place of God, we realize it's highly relevant to our world. If you're doing more doom scrolling than you are spending time with God, it might be that there's a little idol that's going on there in your world and in your reality. Then we get on to our chapter, if you like, and chapter 11 absolutely is all about worship, really. And so Paul deals with two things. Number one, how women should dress in church, and then how we should break bread together. I'll just break into this for one moment. If you take at least the Pentecostal church back 40 or 50 years, we have a very different answer to what Paul says about how women should dress, and in particular, what they should wear on their head now than we had 40 or 50 years ago, despite the fact that we would consider ourselves doing the same honour to chapter 11 as people did 50 years ago, who would have accused us of not honouring the chapter properly. So that's interesting. We are doing things with 1 Corinthians 11 within a 50-year, within a 50-year generation. I, at the age of 61, am old enough to remember the women wearing hats in church, which is certainly within our tradition almost unseen nowadays. And we wouldn't consider ourselves as negating 1 Corinthians chapter 11 at all, kind of thing. Then chapters 12 to 14, that's spiritual gifts, which again would have real relevance to the believers of Corinth. And chapter 15 speaks about resurrection from the dead. And of course, in this world that's heavily inculcated by Greek philosophy, which dismisses the physical as at best irrelevant, Paul has to highlight the importance of bodily resurrection. And I would say, actually, in our modern Western world, we're still quite influenced by Greek philosophy. And we all say we believe in the doctrine of resurrection. I'm speaking in-house now in that language, but we all say we believe in it. I'm not sure we quite do. I'm not sure we quite do believe in it in a way that what happened to Jesus is what's going to happen to us. The same body that was buried is the same body that's raised imperishable in newness of life. So that's a kind of view of 1 Corinthians, chapters 1 to 15 at least.
Brilliant. I'm pretty sure we could have another sort of 10 podcasts on resurrection, bodily resurrection. We could go through it all, and there's so much to dive into on that. The one thing I want to pick up with, and now getting into the passage, this word is used, head. So we've got the head of every man is Christ, the head of the woman is man, the head of Christ is God. What that word is kephale in Greek. What does that word mean? Because I know there's different schools of thought. Some people would say it means authority, and some would say it means source, like the sort of kind of source of a river. What are your thoughts on that? What about the definition of that word and how it's used in the passage?
Yeah. And we obviously set this joke up before we started recording, but we did want to say when we're going to look at the word kephale, we need to treat it very carefully. And I
It's
thank
still a good joke.
It's
Still good.
It's a great one, isn't it? It's a great one. Why didn't we do it before? So let me say a few things here. When we're talking about what words mean, we are speaking about their semantic range. So, for example, if I give you the verb cut, as in I cut, we kind of have an idea of what that word means. We maybe think of a pair of scissors cutting paper, and that's probably the way that we think about it. But what about let's cut a deal together? That's a very different use of that term. What about I'm going to cut across the grass? So, although there's a level of semantic connection between those meanings, there's a kind of root sense. Actually, how it's used in real time can vary a lot. And so, when we're asking and when we're trying to answer the question about what does a particular word mean, and in this case, it's the noun kephale. The only real way to definitively answer it is to see how that word was used in real time in the first century and the surrounding centuries in what would have been Koine Greek texts. So, in other words, there's not a simple answer to that. I've no doubt that there will be some contexts in which it might well be used as the source of a river. I've got no doubt about that. The Hebrew equivalent is the word rosh, which means head. And in fact, we've just finished, if you're in a Jewish context, we've just finished Rosh Hashanah, which is the head of the year. In other words, it's New Year. So the word head in both Hebrew and Greek can have a range of meanings. And I've no doubt that you could make a case based on the papyri, based on the secular papyri and the ancient papyri, that kephale could mean source. Clearly, here in 1 Corinthians 11, it means physical head at one level, because it's speaking about what the woman should wear on her physical kephale head. So it clearly is used of a physical head here. And so I am quite happy about the fact that it does speak with a level of authority over and authority into. So I don't want to pull any clever rabbits out of hats to say, oh, well, if you knew the text, you'd read this in a completely different way to the way it naturally reads to us. I think the key to understanding what Paul means by the term kephale here is the verse you've just read. And if I just spiel on about this for 5 or 10 minutes,
go for it. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Go for it.
And this was obviously, we're speaking about women in leadership here. That's clearly the context that we're speaking into, which is a subject that lots of people have written a lot about and lots of people have lots of opinions on. And we're not going to cover all of that today, but for me, this verse was the central verse that helped to form my mind on this, because all of the other verses that we might think as being relevant towards the conversation about women in leadership, and there are a lot more than the obvious ones, by the way, all of those can be given different understandings, but this verse here is purely theological. Man is head of the woman and he makes things that defy cultural limitations. God is the head of Christ. Well, it doesn't matter what context you're in, we're not going to change that. As Christ is the head of the man, and in this context, the male. Well, whatever happens, we're not going to try and wriggle out of that one, are we? So in as much as we're not going to wriggle out of two of those headship pairings, we're not going to wriggle out of the third one, if you like. So this is, in my mind, pure theology. And this was the central verse for me. And there was a time, and I'll just be honest how I say this, I think while truth does come through understanding, I think it also comes through revelation as well. When you look at how people recognize Jesus and put their faith in him after the empty tomb, if you like, how they recognize him, it's not having come to a certain position of understanding. There's sheer revelation going on. Jesus doesn't pull down some beard disguise and say, it is I, kind of thing. They get this in fact, he speaks the name Mary to Mary. He calls his own sheep by name, if you like, and she hears his voice and she responds. So I do want to say you do need to allow for a level of revelation when you're dealing with the Word of God. Got to have so many caveats to that. You can't put yourself 10 feet above contradiction. But on the other hand, you do need to have the courage of your own convictions, or they're not worth having, are they? So, you've got to, at the right time, form a view on these things and try and walk humbly with the Lord your God in the middle of it all and talk with other people. So I had a revelation. I don't know what it was, but I suddenly saw these verses in a new way. It was the words, the man is head of the woman. And I'm thinking, okay, for me to know what Paul means by head in this context, I've actually got, in good Blue Peter fashion, I've got two he prepared earlier. I've actually got two other examples to compare this to. As God is the head of Christ, Christ is the head of the male. So I can now ask myself a question. God is the head of Christ. Absolutely. Let's not discuss that. Well, we can discuss it, but let's not argue with it. But what does that mean? What does that headship mean? Does that mean that the role of Christ is limited in any way? That there are certain things he's not allowed to do? And I want to say, absolutely not. It's actually precisely because God, the Father, I might want to say, is his head, that therefore all authority, not that Jesus took it, no, because there's headship there, he was given it. All authority has been given to me. So the point of headship in that pairing isn't to restrict, it's to release. And the point of authority is to authorize. You see what I did there? The point of being an authority is to give people authorization. And I don't want to pluck verses out of thin air, but you can't help but think of the words of that centurion. I'm a man under authority, and for that reason, I'm in authority, if you like. So that was the headship thing, that precisely because God is the head of Christ, Christ is ontologically equal with the Father. Now we're going into Trinitarian incarnational language here, so I'm going to try and avoid that. Although, to be fair, your model of the Trinity is directly affected by this, and your understanding of how good team dynamics work is directly affected by this, and we might have time to come on to that later. So the point I just simply want to make here is the sole purpose of headship between God and Christ is for the Father to release the Son and to authorize the Son to have all authority. I can do whatever I like, because even forgive sins, because that's what the Ancient of Days has done to the Son of Man. Just tapping into that Daniel 7 language about the Son of Man. So that's one kind of pairing. The other pairing I want to mention is, of course, the male and Christ. The fact that Christ is my head, does that limit anything I can do? And of course, I want to say no. I don't want to bring out the proof text, but let me wheel out my obvious text on this one. Through Christ, I can do all things. So, in other words, the whole point of headship there is, once again, not to restrict. It is to cover, and it is to, by covering, releasing into everything that I can do. They are working with my authorization. Let me just add a few things on that, by the way. The fact that God is the head of Christ and Christ is the head of the male doesn't mean to say that God isn't my head. That doesn't mean to say that I don't submit to the Father in exactly the same way I submit to the Son. So all of that headship is conferred along the line. So again, those two headship examples, one thing being the head of another, it's clear in my mind the sole purpose of that is to release into everything that I can do. And when I got that, I almost want to, click my fingers just to represent that sense of that, just a penny dropping kind of thing. That now totally determined my understanding of what Paul means when he says the man is the head of the woman. It doesn't mean that Christ is not her head, because that would be, because Christ is the head of the church, and the church is made up of men. So this isn't, there isn't some ring fencing, as it were, between these two, between all of these pairings. It works all the way back up to God. Of course it is. And so that's what I would say headship means. The purpose of headship is to release someone into everything that I can do. It's equipping, releasing, authorizing, lifting up someone's hands, filling up someone's hands so that they can do everything that I can do. And that's how I understand the man is the head of the woman in this context. The point is, therefore, that it is the duty of men to release women into all that men can do, just like God has done to Christ, just like Christ has done to the male. Um, so I could tease out that more. I could go on with that, but that's basically my understanding of headship here in this context.
Yeah, great. Probably it's worth me sort of taking the sort of steel manning the other side of
Yeah.
it and maybe putting some comebacks to you that probably would be people that might listen to this and may have a different interpretation of this. I wonder whether they say, well, Glenn, that's great, but we can't do everything Christ can do. We can't forgive sins.
No, no, and that's good. So a bit of me wants to say, like every good teacher ever says, please hear what I'm saying, don't hear what I'm not saying. So I'm not saying that men and women are the same. I'm quite happy to say women make good mothers, men make good fathers, and those aren't quite the same job, if you like. But that's a very different thing to putting things off limits to people. Um, on the point about forgiveness, of course, itself, I could go back to John chapter 20 and say we're given authority to forgive sins, but what we mean here is we can't do the work of atonement. We can't do the atoning work of Jesus. Absolutely. But of course I could say, but hang on, neither does the Father, neither does the Spirit.
Mm.
So that difference, that that difference cannot build in a de facto inequality. That's the point that I want to make. So Jesus is raised to the level of lordship for the whole of eternity. So we sometimes speak about the subordination of the Son to the Father. And there is a functional, for the purpose of getting the job done, there is a functional subordinationism. I don't mind that. But there's not an eternal subordinationism. That is a classified heresy. There's not eternal subordination, because if there was, Jesus wouldn't be Lord. So it's because of the cross that Jesus is Lord, but he is Lord for the whole of eternity. So I'm not trying to say that men and women are the same. What I'm saying is they have equal dibs on all levels of authorization. That's the point that I want to make. I've no doubt that, and again, I don't want to create stereotypes here. It's not as if there's a certain type of leadership. There's a male leadership, there's a female leadership, there's a you be you. There is an individual part of this. So I'm quite happy with individual gift, but I do believe in equality of authorization, which is what you've got with Jesus. Even though there are things that only Jesus Christ does that the Father doesn't do. We sometimes hear the prayer, don't we, Father, thank you for dying on the cross for me. Well, we get the heart, we get the spirit of that. God's always going to respond to faith. He doesn't respond to my level of theological purity, please. But nonetheless, that's at a theological level, that's not accurate. So absolutely, Christ does a unique work just like you and I can do, but there's no sense in which his role is capped in that by virtue of having that job.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely makes sense. Probably worth then bringing up, what's the verse here? It's verse 7. Help me understand this one, because I wonder whether this could be a comeback as well. So it says,
Yep.
man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. Talk to me about that, because I think that could be a comeback to say, well, look, this is a kind of divine ordering of how things should work. Therefore, men should take leadership roles and women should not, and that might well be used in that context.
Sure. Yeah. No. Absolutely. So let me tell you how I would understand verse 7. And again, I'm not trying to do any clever sleight of hand. I don't want to culturally dismiss this verse. This verse is part of all scripture, is given by God and is useful. So I'm not trying to do anything clever. I'm happy for people to do clever things. That's just not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to do it simply. So let's just have a little look at that, because I think how we read this verse actually betrays not a fair reading of Genesis chapters 1 and 2, which is obviously what it's going back to. Man's made first and then the woman. So this is the way we read this verse, and this is how we read Genesis chapters 1 and 2. The man is made first, and by the man we mean the male, and then separately, later, the woman is made and given to the man. But I want to suggest to you, if we read those creation accounts in the way that Bible believers would tend to read them, and I want to say in the way that Paul himself would have read it, we read as Genesis chapter 1 happening first, Genesis chapter 2, a more detailed discussion of what happens in the creation of Adam. So let's have a look at the creation of the man in Genesis chapter 1, because it's not just the male. If you read Genesis chapter 1, no, male and female he made them. And you've got male and female in the one flesh. In male and female he made them. In the image of God he made them. And of course, that now sets us up for what we're going to read in chapter 2, where the woman isn't made separately from the man and brought to him. She's separated out from the man. You know, his little poem he writes isn't just a little, romantic ditty. It's literally, this is bone out of my bone. This is flesh out of my flesh. For this reason, within marriage, we now reunite those two separate fleshes, and therefore they are now once again one flesh. So this actually is fundamental for your definition of what marriage is. It's amazing how so many things are interlinked with this. When you get one bit of your theology with a certain understanding, it has a knock-on effect on everything else, if you like. So marriage, by definition, is two people becoming one. I'm old enough to hear the words of an old Spice Girls song coming into my head now, which I'll stop myself singing. So in Genesis chapter 1, when it says he is the image and the glory of God, careful, that's the male and the female together. If we're just going to say the male is for the glory of God, well, we've got to be consistent and say that means that only the male is for the image of God, which we know is not true. Male and female he made them. In the image of God he made them. So I want to say that actually when he says Adam, the man, is made for the image of glory of God, that includes the man and the woman in the one flesh. Otherwise, we're going to say women aren't made in the image of God. Well, we're not going to do that, are we, people? Or we're going to say women aren't made to glorify God. Well, we're not going to say that, are we, people? So what's happening is when the woman's separated out from the man, that now gives her a further function, which is to glorify the man. Absolutely, she is there to bring glory to him. I'm quite happy with a further function for the female, but I'm not happy for a lesser function. And I think what Paul's doing in quite a few of these verses is trying to make a point that now we've corrected a power dynamic. Now we've created equality. Let's now not invert the dynamic. Let's not now have, to have women over men always and on every occasion is an equal error to have women under men on equal and every occasion. There's now this, we need each other. So for every single point that Paul brings out of here to say, hey, we need to hear it for men, he brings in an equal point to say, and we need to hear it for women. So, for example, I'm just going to bring up the verses here so I can read them for myself. He's going to say, man didn't come from woman, but woman came out of man, which is perfectly true. But of course, it's equally true, and we won't get too graphic about it, but it's equally true that the first man came out of the first woman came out of a man, but ever since then, every man has come out of a woman. And I don't think about that too much, but that's just the reality of,
Yeah, yeah.
life, for Jesus included, I want to say. So I think that we misread verse 7. If we're really going to seriously say the male exclusively is made for the image and the glory of God, we have not read Genesis chapter 1 properly. And we haven't read the separation that goes on in Genesis chapter 2 properly. And therefore, we don't have a good theological basis for what it means for the man to once again become one flesh. That's why the man and the woman can be naked together and feel no shame, because you don't feel shame when you're naked and you're on your own. Well, when you're in one flesh, you're on your own. You're a single unity again. So it makes, and we could say more about that, but we'll say enough. And of course, in the Lord, verse 11, and this is the real clincher. In the Lord, woman is not independent of man, absolutely right, nor is man independent of woman. So I would understand those verses 7 and onwards, making sure we're giving mutual honor to both of the genders, both to men and to women. And just to sum it up again, I know I'm going on, but I think that Paul is thinking about the male exclusively when he says he was made in the image of glory of God, and then the woman was made separately I think that's misreading of Genesis chapters 1 to 2.
What would that mean then for marriage, in the sense of how we think about how marriages should work? So this is something that's very different from the man is to lead, the woman is to take a subordinate role. You're kind of, in one sense, there's a much more of a both and leading in that sense. Yeah. Talk to me about that, kind of almost like a plurality of leading.
Yes, yeah, and I would say if we're going to buy into this model of headship as mutual deferment, mutual respect, actually this has massive implications for our understanding of marriage and our understanding of the Trinity as well, and our understanding of how church leadership should work. It fits all of those things. So within marriage, you need to understand that the fundamental definition of marriage is that, two have become one, like those great theologians, the Spice Girls once said, two become, that's what it is. And therefore, I need to be careful I put this, because we need to be delicate. That, for me, therefore, determines the primary purpose of physical union. In a very physical way, there really is the bringing into each other of two fleshes into one. So, for this, so when it speaks about the man and the woman for naked, it's giving that whole notion of actually when two have become one, that act of physical union is the physical expression of two people as one flesh, which tells me something interesting. We often buy into the language of the primary purpose of marriage is procreation. And I want to say, no, that's the secondary purpose of marriage. The primary purpose of marriage is two people becoming one. That's really important. Or we go down this line of, until a married couple have had children, they're not really married, or there was no point in them getting married. Well, let's not go down that round, people. The primary purpose of marriage is that expressing, and the primary purpose of physical union is that expressing. That's why Paul says to the Corinthians, you are joining yourself as one flesh when you're sleeping with the person that's not your wife, your partner for life, if you like. So I think this has major implications for how we do marriage. And of course, Paul's going to bring this out in Ephesians chapter 5, husbands and wives, what man doesn't take proper care of his body? And I could ask you the question about your body. What's the most important bit of your body? Is it your body or your head? And I would say, without both of them, neither one works. A head
Yes.
without a body is dead. A body without a head is dead. And this analogy of one body. So Paul says, husbands, love your wives. Absolutely. What are we saying? Are we saying that wives don't need to love their husbands? Of course we're not. We, of course, wives, respect your husbands. What are we saying, that husbands shouldn't respect their wives? Of course we're not. And I would say a sign of every healthy marriage is mutual deferment, mutual gift. And we often quote that verse, wives, submit to your husbands, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22, is it? But we don't cite the previous verse, Ephesians 5:21, which is submit to one another. And then the verb is supplied, and don't forget, wives, this also includes you to your husbands. So this is not saying that wives are the only people to submit to husbands. No, submit to one another. So let me go out on a limb there. If I take that opening verse properly, that means husbands, submit to your wives. It's a mutual thing. It's not every and this is the way that every team works. There must be mutual submission within a team, or you've got a powder keg waiting to go off. You've got someone that's not accountable. And I genuinely would say to this: you look at a friendship, you look at a relationship, you look at a team, you look at a marriage where there is someone who is always the boss. I guarantee you've got a problem there. I guarantee you've got a problem there. It's not on about individual gift, it's on about shared governance, it's on about shared responsibility. And I think this has massive implications for how marriage should work. Absolutely.
And by extension, leadership teams in churches, of course.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I think team leadership is often misunderstood. And I think that team leadership is not committee leadership. Committee leadership is playing to the lowest common denominator. If there's no one who objects to this, we will do it. Team leadership is paying to the highest numerator, if you like. Leadership is out of respect and out of trust. That's the point. We can't leave these things out of a church dynamic, can we? Because then we're running a company. Nothing wrong with running a company, but don't call it a church. That's all. Actually, and you do need to have business principles in a church, of course you do. But you've got to have the Holy Spirit as well, please. And so, yeah, absolutely. I want to say that out of love and out of respect and out of trust, and I can tell you, those are the things that set the level for how efficient the team and how well and how godly the team is working together. Out of that, there is mutual recognition of individual gift, and there is mutual accountability. And I would describe team leadership as individual gift, shared governance. And I think that one of the New Testament examples I go to as a go-to for that, there's number I could, but is in Acts chapter 16, where Paul has a vision of a man from Macedonia beckoning us. That's really important to know. It is individual gift. God doesn't fill teams, doesn't even fill marriages. He fills individuals. He gives gifts to people and he makes people gifts. So this is me bringing my game to the team. This is me bringing God's gifting on my life to us, if you like. But it's interesting. Paul has the vision. So I'm quite happy with a visionary lead language. Quite happy there's someone in the team that has that gift that we recognize and that we defer to. But Paul has the vision, but then it says, and so we concluded. It doesn't say he, it said we concluded. And in fact, that's the first of a whole number of we's in Acts. And this is the start of what we call the we passages. That's why some people think that Luke, one of Paul's traveling companions, must be the writer of this, because he's writing in the first person plural, if you like. It's one of his traveling. So that's where the we passages begin. And I love that dynamic. Paul had the vision. He clearly shares it with the team, and they've got enough confidence in him to go along with it and give it the assent. And I think that's a classic working example of what I would describe as team leadership.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, who would have thought, from one passage alone, we get so much richness in terms of, we're talking about women in leadership, but we're also talking about leadership in itself and marriage, and all these things are all put in one passage, and we can just bring so much from that. So, Glenn, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. There's so much more we could talk on this subject, and I'm sure we'll talk about other ones. I'm pretty sure I'm booking in a whole series of podcasts with you to talk about resurrection or something like that. We'll do that. We'll get a third guest. Get you on a third time at some point. But for now, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. So thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this episode of That CPD Show. For more episodes, why not subscribe and give us a review? It really helps us out. See you next time.